continue the...
I think I have a different role now.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a role is much easier for me because I'm continuing now as the chair of the next session. And so, yeah, everybody is ready. Whoever needs to move is moving. Okay. All right. So let me begin. Neil, everything's okay? Yeah, okay. So I'm deeply honored to present Neil MacGregor. And I'm extremely pleased and flattered that he came to be with us this evening for this event. In my fantasies, there's really nobody else in the world I'd like better to close this very moving event. Okay, hang on. I'll let people shift around. And here he is. Neil MacGregor didn't invent the interest of cultural historians in objects and material culture, but he probably inspired it. He inspired this key move, really, in writing of history more than any other individual. This is the obvious connection to my book, focused as it is on one object, and trying to make it speak on a global scale. With Neil MacGregor's History of the World in 100 Objects, Neil literally invented the genre. And in a highly original way, because this started as a BBC4 radio broadcast, then podcast, what we now would call podcast, that is to say without visuals. So objects had to be described with words and their functions explained with the audience visualizing these objects in their mind. Now this book had an amazing effect over the last decade, and if you just look at the screen now, you'll see the great many other 100 objects that have come through in a whole variety of different ways. I love the last one, just published in time for the coronation, the history of Royal Britain, 100 objects, but actually there are dozens and dozens of them. I just chose a few here with different titles. I mean, literally, Neil invented a whole new genre and a very successful one. In terms of his training, Neil studied modern languages, then philosophy, then law. He was actually called to the bar, and only then arrived at art history. Such a broad education, which should really be the fantasy of any scholar in the humanities, helps understand the incredibly broad range of questions that Neil tackles in his work. I'll just mention two other books, so we don't have much time. A book titled Germany, Memories of a Nation, which is a delight of insights into many things German that you know and many things German that you do not know. And his latest book, Living with the Gods, which tries to answer a very simple question, which is one crucial to our age, the age we live in. What do we make of the comeback of religion worldwide? Not irrelevant in Israel in these days as well. But Neil is not only a scholar. He's also a major figure in running and directing many of the key art repositories of the world. You all know that Neil directed the National Gallery in London, and then the British Museum, and then also the innovative Humboldt Forum in Berlin, which he was instrumental in setting up. Indeed, for Neil, these positions are a direct extension of his intellectual interests. And this is, to show this is what he writes in the introduction to the History of the World in 100 Objects about a decade ago. I'll just read this sentence. Telling history through things is what museums are for. And because the British Museum has, for over 250 years, been collecting things from all around the globe, it's not a bad place to start if you want to use objects to tell a history of the world, which is what that series did. Telling history through things is what museums are for. That's wonderfully put. And how do museums achieve this goal? And I think Neil's view of what museums are and how they should do this becomes especially clear for one position that he deliberately chose not to take. I hope this is public knowledge. In 2008, it's going to be now, in 2008, Neil was invited to take on the position of director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, but he refused. And why did he refuse? Well, there was a reason, because the Met charges admission. And this goes against Neil's deep belief in the role of the museum as a civic institution. A civic institution intended for the betterment of humanity, all humanity, and which thus should not charge people for coming to enjoy it. But how does a museum actually work to connect all histories of humanity as a global story? This is a difficult challenge, and it is what Neil is doing right now He's recently taken up a new museum in Mumbai that strives to tell Indian history in a global context, and this is a story he will now tell you himself. So Neil, I'm very grateful that you took the time to come to Jerusalem for this event, and everybody please join me in welcoming Mr. Neil MacGregor.
I hope my presentation is there, is it? So you need to
hang on. We need to get out of this and into yours. Just a minute. For some reason this is not moving, right? What am I doing wrong here? So I lost the, I think the computer is, אני לא מצליח לי, את רואה? נעלם. אולי מפה, הנה מפה. Okay. That's perfect. Okay, and here we go.
Okay, thank you. Dror, thank you very much for that very, very generous introduction. And Shai and Shulimi, thank you very much for the invitation here this evening. I feel rather nervous embarking at 8:20 after the day you've had. I think the Court of Human Rights would regard this as a cruel and unnatural punishment. And I can't even speak as fast as Dror, so I shall try very hard. But I wanted to start by congratulating Dror on this remarkable book, because what he's shown, I think, is that in the objects you've been looking at, as well as a triumph of the goldsmith's art, there is, among other things, an attempt at a globalized theology, an idea that it is possible, that late 17th century idea, that behind all the religions of the world there is actually something in common, and that they're all imperfect strivings, imperfect understandings of what ultimately was, of course, gratefully revealed through the Abrahamic monotheisms to those who were lucky enough to be in that tradition. But that there is a globalized theology, a global world. It's an attempt to make sense of the world, that object, a world that is changing very fast at the end of the 17th century, after the religious wars, at a moment of scientific explosion. What has just been happening is, of course, Newton, Leibniz, the whole world is changing. It's what the piece is about, and it's what I want to talk about now, because it's all about making sense of the world and where we take our place in it. And I, like I imagine many of us, grew up in a world that looked like this, and we all know exactly where we are in it. If you're British, you're lucky enough to be right in the middle of it, because the meridian 0 runs right through London. But even for the unfortunate rest of the world, you know where you stand. And this is the world in which we all grew up, which we make sense of ourselves and make sense of the world. We all know this world is ridiculous. This is a concept, a conception, a projection, Mercator's in this case, a projection in every sense that doesn't make sense. And in recent time, we've realized that, of course, there are many other ways of looking at the world where it immediately becomes much harder to know where you are. You have to look to find the place that you thought was so familiar to you. This is a world that we know politically, the global south is now a different kind of concept, and where we are in it is changing and will go on changing. We have to negotiate it. But the most important map, I think, for me of recent times is the one produced in China about 10 years ago. And it's a map of the world as it is and as it will be, predicated on the fact that the Arctic Ocean is melting and that the old routes of contact, trade across the world are changing in a way we cannot imagine. If what you see, as you hope you can see here, is that here is Shanghai. In the old days, the goods of the world would come this way around India, through the Red Sea, this way. You don't need to do that any longer. You just go through the Arctic, and here is Rotterdam. It's the world that you are all likely to be living in if you live long enough. It's the world that we have to make sense of. And in some ways it's terrifyingly new. The goods are going to move in a different way. The people are going to move in a different way. And as always, when people move, their gods move with them. And the gods is what I want to talk about, because the gods, as Dror has demonstrated, is very largely what that extraordinary piece of Goldsmith's work is about. And I want to begin with a divine figure, or a divinized figure, that was discovered last year in Egypt, on the Red Sea coast of Egypt in Berenike. It's marble, and as you can see, it's a statue of the Buddha. It was an astonishing surprise. You can read more about it in the New York Review of Books by William Dalrymple. And it was found with other images of Indian deities and figures of worship, demonstrating what, in a sense, we already knew, but demonstrating in a new way that the links between the religions of India and of the Far East and of the Mediterranean were close and frequent, and that this must have been carved. It's carved in Egyptian marble, the key point. It's made in Egypt, representing the Buddha, presumably for an Indian or a devotee of the Buddha who is in the Red Sea, is in Egypt. It's not the only example of that sort we've had. Long ago, in Pompeii, this statue, this little ivory carved image, often called Lakshmi, the goddess of good fortune, probably more a yogini, a female nature spirit. I'm terrified saying any of these things with Professor Schulman across the room. So if you would raise your hand when I make a significant mistake, I'd be very grateful, because I shall. Possibly the handle for a mirror. Mirrors, again, having played rather a large part this evening, in the ruins in Pompeii, showing again that the contacts between the Roman Empire, in the 2nd, 3rd century here, CE, were close, frequent, and at a level of luxury that might surprise. What is all this about? Why is all this important? It's another global object which you didn't list in your mention. It's about pepper. Pepper is what this all rests on. Exports of pepper from India to the Roman Empire are colossal. India, then as now, is where you get taste in your food. And in Berenike, again, they found all kinds of other Indian spices that were being imported into Rome. Hundreds of thousands of pounds. The Roman writers complain about the amount of bullion going from Rome to India for pepper. What you're looking at, we're now in Norfolk, in the east of England, and you're looking at a pepper pot. It was found in a hoard, buried, doubtless, when the barbarians, which is another word for the Europeans, the continentals, were about to cross the North Sea, probably in the 4th century, as the Roman power is waning. And every time there was a raid, of course, the rich is a very rich area of England agriculturally. You bury the valuables and you run, and you hope you'll come back. In this order, 3 pepper pots. The pepper contained in this, it pours out through holes in her head, and you feed it in at the bottom, would have been worth so many annual wages, and there are 3 of them in the hoard. Pepper is what it's about, but it's also that when the goods move, the gods move, and in the Roman Empire, the gods are shared and are found everywhere, as are the products of India. And this is, of course, what lies behind, as we were seeing, the throne of the great Mogul, with the throne and the scepter, as part of this extraordinary notion of a global theology that you look at in miniature, you play around, you become God, you can move it around, you can see how all these different adumbrations of the central divine truth are available. I think it's not surprising that it's now that Dror is talking about this, because I think it's not an exaggeration to say that if you would talked about all this 50, 70 years ago, most people would have argued that religion in the world, religion in the life of the world today, was coming to an end. That the religion as a social force, a public force, was declining, and with time, fulfilling the Marxian dream, it would wither away, and people would be free of superstition and misunderstanding. It's an image given, to my mind, the supreme expression by a Soviet poster of 1973. Soviet Union riding high at that moment, technically and in every other way. And the poster they produced was to celebrate the great achievements of 1961, when Yuri Gagarin is the first man in space. And here the Soviet Union has gone to heaven. Yuri Gagarin looks around and says, Boga, нет, there is no God. There is no God. And below, as you can see, tilting and about to top the mosque, the Orthodox Church, and the Catholic Church, all on their way out, left behind, about to fall over. It's the perfect example, I think, of where most intellectuals and most sociologists thought the world was heading in the 1970s. It was also, of course, the continuation of a Soviet view that religion was not part of our understanding of the world, impeded our understanding of the world. In 1931, Stalin blows up the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour in Moscow as part of the destruction of many churches. Others, as you know, are used as storehouses, and in Petersburg, Leningrad, the great Kazan Cathedral is turned into the Museum of Atheism. This is the moment. If we move 20 years forward to the 1990s, the church that Stalin blew up has reappeared. The Russian state, after the collapse of as the Soviet Union disintegrates, rediscovers its Orthodox identity as the key to Russia, which will survive when the Soviet Union disappears. And as the atheist Soviet Union, made up of all these nationalities whose religions were just about to totter and collapse, goes, and Russia is left, Russia rediscovers that its central identity is a religious one. And the idea of Orthodox Russia as the central notion of identity is, of course, very strong in our day. In 2017, on the Feast of the Epiphany, President Putin himself carries out the old Orthodox tradition of bathing in the icy water, wearing, as you may not be able to see, of course, a gold cross around his neck, and very particularly surrounded by icons. This icon is Our Lady of Kazan, Our Lady of Kazan, who protects Russia against foreign aggressors. It is a statement of a theological policy, an identity for Russia, and a foreign policy, because part of Orthodox Russia, the mother of Orthodox Russia, is Kiev. What is happening at the moment is directly connected to this way of thinking about the world and of thinking about the nation, the state, and its position in the world. The gods are back, and they're back not only in Soviet Russia or in post-Soviet Russia, they're back in Istanbul as well. The Mosque of Hagia Sophia, the church of Hagia Sophia, the great church of Justinian in 537, built the greatest Christian church in the world and remains that for 1,000 years, becomes, of course, the mosque in 1453 when the Muslims conquer, when Mehmet conquers Constantinople. It remains the mosque, the theatre of state religion, just as the church had been until the First World War. Hagia Sophia, this building, is where the identity of the polity based in Constantinople, based in Istanbul, is played out. And in 1934, after Ataturk has taken over Turkey, secularized the state, separated mosque and state, Hagia Sophia becomes a museum. It's the great statement that this is a lay society, and this great religious building will now be a secular museum. And it remains a secular museum until the 24th of July, a few years ago, when President Erdogan declares that it is now returned to its function as a mosque, and he starts the prayers, leading the prayers by reading from the Quran on the 24th of July 2 years ago in the mosque, in what was in the new mosque again of Hagia Sophia. Once again, it is the place where the identity of the polity is played out. And the day he chooses, the 24th of July, is no accident. That is the day when the Treaty of Lausanne was signed in 1923, which recognized that Turkey had beaten the Greeks in Anatolia, when the Allied forces stopped the occupation of Constantinople, and Turkey, modern Turkey, became a fully autonomous, recognized state. And what happened in Russia, what happened in Turkey, is also happening in India. What you're looking at is the great mosque in Ayodhya. Ayodhya in northern India, where the Mughal emperor, after the Islamic conquest of India, Babur builds, or according to general legend or narrative, it is probably later, builds the great mosque in Ayodhya. It remains a great mosque until the 6th of December 1992, which is the day you're looking at. On that day, as a result of a great deal of political agitation, Hindu mobs storm the mosque and they demolish it within a day. The entire mosque is demolished. And it's demolished because they assert that on that site was a temple to the god Rama, that indeed this was where he was born. And once it's been demolished, on the 5th of August 2020, Prime Minister Modi, the Prime Minister of the secular state of India, wearing saffron, lays the foundation stone of the new temple of Ram, one of the manifestations of the god Vishnu, in Ayodhya, on the site of the destroyed mosque. It is a complete transformation. We cannot understand, we cannot make sense of the world today without thinking about religions and the notion of one globalized religion in which we might all somehow come together, where we might all understand ourselves. The dream of Aurangzeb's court, in that, the dream of Leibniz, that there would somehow be a universal understanding and that all was indeed for the best in this best of all possible worlds, can no longer be sustained in the light of all this. And there's one, I think, really very, very happy conclusion to this beginning, if you like. This, as we looked at, was the 1975 version of the Soviet dream. In 2007, on the space station, the Malaysian astronaut, Sheikh Muzaffar, had to ask instructions as, how do I face Mecca when I'm in the space station? And what you see is the result. It's decided that you can't have a proper Qibla to tell you where Mecca is, but you can take a view from the space station of where you think Mecca might be at that particular moment, and you can therefore perform the prayers that are your obligation. And I think those two together tell us what has happened in 30 extraordinary years. And if we want to make sense of the world, we have to remember religion is back. And of course, it hasn't gone away. In some places it never went away. In some places that were too lazy to think about it, never got round to reconsidering the relationship between church and state. The idea of the crown and the throne is still very much with us, and indeed the crown and the scepter that we saw with Aurangzeb, as you can see, is still very present in the coronation of last week. A coronation in which the old oaths were taken to preserve the supremacy of the Church of England, the Protestant Church. Meaningless in many ways in contemporary Britain, and the king himself insisting that although the ritual had to continue, representatives of other faiths had to be present, very aware that very large numbers of his subjects are not members of the Church of England in any recognizable sense, and indeed that an enormous proportion of the British population is now Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, or of no belief at all. This is one example of an exhibition at the British Museum that we did on Hajj, which did tell you how to find Mecca when you wanted to pray to it. And you can see this is a London audience, and here's another London audience at an exhibition on the goddess Durga, whom we heard about earlier on, the statue of Durga. What I want to look at is what this means for museums. Museums were set up in most of Europe on a French model that you looked at the objects with no consideration of the content that might have a religious dimension. The secular state looked at the objects as works of art, works of craftsmanship, without talking about what they were meant for, and without looking at what they meant. But I wanted to think for a minute about what this object, the court of Aurangzeb, might mean in India today, because Aurangzeb is very, very big news in India, and very unpleasant news. You see from this BBC thing, why is a Mughal emperor who died 300 years ago being debated on social media? He was, as you heard, the emperor who expanded Mughal rule more than anybody before. Almost all of modern India, almost all of it, was somehow under his sway. He was also a very extreme Muslim ruler, although also supported the construction of many Hindu temples. But he is now anathematized in an India which no longer has a secular view of itself, whatever the constitution says. The old view of India is summed up in this school textbook from Mumbai of 10 years ago. This is for about 10-year-olds. And as you can see here, Hindu goddess, here is the emblem of India, the Buddhist ruler, Ashoka, with the 3 lions. Here is the great museum in Mumbai, which we're talking about. Here is the Taj Mahal. So we have Muslim monuments, Hindu monuments, Buddhist monuments. We have Karl Marx here, we have the Mona Lisa here, and the British Museum. It's an extraordinary view of the world, but a very, very much the view of Nehru's India, a secular state, with all its traditions, part of the wider world. No longer. Aurangzeb is somebody that is simply persona non grata. The Sanskriti culture program of India, this is the traditional Hindu traditional Hindu organization, now publishes works on him, Aurangzeb the Tyrant. It is alleged, with absolutely no evidence, that he wanted to destroy the Bamiyan Buddhas, and would have done so had he had a chance. But Aurangzeb Road is now renamed in Delhi. Aurangabad, the town he named after himself, was renamed on the 29th of June last year. This is very topical. Aurangzeb is very serious. On the 29th of June last year, Aurangabad, which was a very large city in the state of Maharashtra, was renamed Chhatrapati Sambhaji Nagar. That Chhatrapati Sambhaji is a Maratha ruler, an Indian Muslim ruler, who fought against him and whom he executed. And Aurangzeb Road can't possibly stay. You can see the image has been defaced. It's been renamed after a president of India, Abdul Kalam, and the campaign to do it had statements like, there's no Hitler Road in Israel, then why Aurangzeb Road in Delhi? This tells you what's happening in India about the view of Islam, Aurangzeb, Islam in India, and the demonization of the Mughal period in history as a foreign conquest, an alien conquest that set out to destroy real Indian culture, and that there's no place in India for that view of its history, and that the Muslim threat to Indian culture, Indian identity, has to be identified and thought about very carefully. It's a huge factor in Indian politics at the moment, and not just in Indian politics. European politics have been largely dominated by the same phenomenon. This is the German movement protest in Dresden, exactly outside the building where Aurangzeb's court is held. From the Pegida movement, the Patriotische Europäer, Patriotic Europeans gegen die Islamisierung des Abendlandes, against the Islamization of the West. And Mrs. Merkel shown in the burqa, in the hijab, with the Bundestag behind, and on the top of the Bundestag, the crescent. They're going to take over Germany unless they're stopped. Even Switzerland, peaceful, tolerant Switzerland, was so outraged by the presence of minarets beside traditional churches, although it seems to me they complement each other rather well. And they decided to have a referendum in 2009 on the topic, and that banned the building of further minarets in Switzerland. Extraordinary. You are not now allowed to build a minaret in Switzerland. You can build a mosque, but not a minaret. And in Paris in the spring, which we all dream of, if you'd been in Paris in the spring in 2017, this is what you'd have found. French citizens in Clichy protesting about the fact that they don't have a mosque. And the tensions between the Muslims in France wanting to exist as a religious community in the nation state, unacceptable in many ways to a French notion where there's only one identity, which is French national identity, and no other communal identity can be imagined. What does this mean for the museums? This is enormous. We haven't had anything like this in Europe since the Second World War. And it is a very big question. The Louvre has recently reorganized its Islamic arts around les arts de l'islam, rayonne, shine out in the Louvre. And I have to make one rather significant typographical point here. You will notice that it's les arts de L', Islam. In French, if you want to make a distinction between Islam the religion and Islam the culture, Islam the religion has a small I. That puts it in its place. Islam the culture has a capital I. It's very difficult when somebody's speaking to know whether they've pronounced an I as a capital or a lower case. It is absolutely life and death in a state religion, in a state museum. And so les arts de l'islam as a culture, but not, of course, as a religion, are presented. Can you separate in a culture where the word decorates so many objects, the word which is believed to be the divine word, so many objects that are the arts? Can you separate the two? Does it make sense? And what does it mean to an Islamic Frenchman or a French woman who is a Muslim? How does the museum handle it? One of the critical objects, which tells, I think, a great deal about the history of this and the problems for museums, is the masterpiece they hold of Islamic metalwork. It's, as you can see, it's a very beautiful large bowl, a basin, almost certainly made to wash hands in for ceremonial events, for princely receptions of guests. And it was made in Syria, Egypt, we're not quite sure where, somewhere around 1320. And it's signed several times by its maker, Muhammad ibn Azayn. And it has brass, but with wonderful inlay work of piece of metalwork. Somewhere around 1450, it turned up in the French royal collections. We don't know how. The French royal arms. That's all, as it were, par for the course in terms of Europe's engagement with the rest of the world. What is not par for the course is that this baptismal font of St. Louis, it's actually made 50 years after he dies. But from 1601, when the future Louis III, right up to Napoleon III's son, the Prince Impérial, in the middle of the 19th century. What do you do with an object like this? I mean, Saint Louis is, of course, the great. He is recognized at the Musée des Colonies on the outskirts of Paris, an inscription on the side wall saying that he is the beginning of the French colonial adventure. And yet, known as, it's quite easy to change the name of a street, even to change the name of a city. But the whole of the academic literature on Islamic metalwork will be thrown into disarray if this is no longer called the Baptistère de Saint-Louis. And that's a step, obviously, no one could contemplate. But, and of course, they do explain in the label that this is all a historical nonsense. But something else happens in the way India, because we're talking about India with Aurangzeb, is shown in the museums in Paris. For historical reasons, the Louvre is the Levant as well. But in that Islamic Levant, all the Indian objects that are Islamic have been included. So, as it were, the other traditions are at the Musée Guimet. There you see Hindu India, Buddhist India, Jain India. And this is, I think, the most extraordinary phenomenon and danger for a museum, that you have, in fact, an argument for Modi's political reading of India, that there's real India here, Asian India in Guimet, along with the Chinese, the Indo-Chinese, and Asia, and the Muslims, who are essentially a non-Indian, an alien culture elsewhere in the Louvre. And it goes against so much of the most valuable in Indian culture. This is the grandfather of Aurangzeb. Here, the Mughal emperor, the Muslim emperor, visiting Hindu admiration by the Islamic rulers of the Hindu traditions. Something that's being destroyed at the moment in Paris by the presentation, and which keeps coming back. Museums address this. I mean, what can they do? And I think one of the things they can do is talk about the difference between monotheisms and polytheisms, and the sort of meals she might have spiced in 3rd, 4th century Norfolk, and what that might have been in. And in the 1840s, not far from where she was found, archaeologists found a Roman cause of food, but in fact, a belief system, or in fact, several belief systems. Because what is so remarkable about this is that this is, again, presumably buried in our era. And here, you have all these, the large heads here would have been on wooden bodies, certainly some of the silver elements. And here you have Jupiter, the Roman god, the god of thunder, the supreme god. In the European tradition, of course, wisdom is wisdom in war as well. An interesting combination, conflation. And these two, of course, are regular, and this is Helios, Sol, god of the sun, or beautiful figure of the sun, and these are Roman gods that by this stage have they've become one composite god. The Greek gods and the Roman gods have fused and merged, so that when they arrive in England, they've already got dual nationality. What Roman god you find everywhere in the household. But then, very fascinatingly, these two birds, birds with a stone in their beak, birds which you find in Celtic ritual sites from Central Europe, Hungary, right the way to Ireland. We don't know what they're about. Element is involved. These have no place in Roman religion at all. They are Celtic, local British traditions added to the Roman mix. And most interesting of all, the wheel is the emblem of and he had been worshipped before the British came, before the Romans came. He goes on being worshipped, and it is this extraordinary capacity of the Roman polytheism to bring the gods of the people you conquer into your own temples. You give them the honor, come us, because we revere their gods. And we have absolute proof of this as a fact in this altar from Chester, a couple of 100 miles away, which is inscribed Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Jupiter great and best, Jupiter Optimus Maximus Tanarus. Both gods, both potentially in syntactical terms Optimus and Maximus, and both the same god. It's an extraordinary achievement of a polytheism that you can use it to embrace the people you conquer. This is a local god from here. This is Baal, the Levantian god, in the form of a conical stone, is given his temple, just as Isis and Osiris from Egypt are given temples in Rome. And it's what allowed, it was the great gift of Hinduism, that it could always absorb new people. And one of the happiest things I found last year in a wayside stall for religious images in India was here is Ambedkar, the great politician from the Dalit, the untouchable caste, who wrote the Indian Constitution and is revered by many as semi-divine and takes his... it can accommodate anything. And that's what, of course, is in danger of being lost. And I want to finish with the work that's going on at the moment in the museum that we saw briefly before on the cover in Mumbai, where in their relation to the gods' work, outside just an Indian context. The building itself, as you can see, is a splendid colonial building put up around 1910 in a style called Indo-Saracenic, which is the same kind as the Prince of Wales Museum. It's now been renamed the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya. Chhatrapati Shivaji is another of these local rulers who fought Aurangzeb, and therefore is a Muslim, a Hindu hero against the Muslims. But given that name, most people just call it about the Buddha that travelled, that was found in Berenike last year, and the links between the connections or non-connections between, if you like, the gods, what only museums can do, allowing stories, allowing questions to be asked that are more easily asked through objects than through texts. This wonderful Buddha is, as you can see, I think, strongly influenced by drapery from the classical West, from the Hellenistic world, and that's a long-established topos of art history. What the museum wants, and so in a project which is funded very generously by the Getty Foundation, the museum in Mumbai is borrowing from the British Museum a very large number of objects from those cultures, but for a long period, not short-term exhibition, long enough to organize university teaching and school teaching over several years. so that a generation of Indian students will be able to think about their world. And so another Buddha from Gandhara on the left from Indian collections will go beside the Dionysus, the Bacchus from the British Museum. You can see the former points of the drapery, but also son of Shiva. What is being looked at here is not just the formal ways of imagining the divine, how you think of the divine, but what the notion of the divine is. How is that this is a new way of proceeding. The Indian Museum is deciding what it borrows, and instead of sending the information that in London and Berlin are being asked to answer questions which they had never, ever thought about before, in looking at how these objects, like the Dionysus in the middle, some of whom, very many of whom can't read, how will they engage with these other gods? And how do you show, can you show, are still venerated? It's not a question that in a Western museum is asked, or indeed matters. What's become very clear, and I find this an extraordinarily fascinating thing, is that, of course, to a public, this is familiar. And interestingly, every Indian, of course, Muslim or Hindu, or they know how to use them. They know how it should behave to you and how you should behave to it, in a way that, of course, Western curious than we expected, about the goddess Sekhmet from Egypt. She's the goddess, she can also destroy you. But it was, of course, nobody asked the question when they did their public research about why does the female figure have a lion's head. I mean, that's what you would expect a god, to show that a god is more than human, when a Hindu goddess is actively destroying evil or actively doing something else. But what became most of all striking was gods like this, the Egyptian, the divine was limited to the human. The divine was given form only as human form. Because in the middle of these gods, going to be about 12 of them from Berlin and London, we're going to exhibit this image right in the center, which is one of the avatars of the god Vishnu, a god who rescues and restores order after the confusion of necessary destructions, the cycles of destruction, but then after that, Vishnu intervenes in an avatar. He takes the form of Adivaraha, the mud of a collapsing world. This is the god of the Mediterranean. Don't intervene in this way, and certainly don't change form. This will be in the middle. The constant question, the dancing Shiva in the ring of fire, the dancing eternally with, of course, the extra hands that let you know that this is just like ours. This became a really fascinating setting behind all these, breaks down a complete question that was asked by most members of the public, the fundamental question for the statue of a god. It's not one that Western curators think about. And what's become clear to me is the extent to which we have anestheticized. That was the first point. The second point was that he was wearing sandals. Wearing sandals. Why their feet would be protected? A very puzzling idea. And then, most interesting of all, to my mind, the divine, by looking at the eyes of the god, which have been painted, and the god looks at you. What is the relationship between the votary, the devotee, and a god that won't acknowledge their presence? Is how radically different this notion of giving form to the divine and then interacting with it as part of a society is. But again, the question of how do you know that a Greek god is a Greek god? Because they are perfectly beautiful. They are more beautiful than you can be. This is as much an aberration from the norm as extra arms for an Indian god idea. For the Indians. And indeed, one that when the curators were articulating it, they themselves began to wonder how it will allow certain fairly comparative systems. This is the god of the inundation of the Nile. We saw him briefly in the Tavernier on the offerings table of the fruits of the Nile, on which, of course, Egypt depends. And that will be shown beside that the river is itself divine, and the river must be worshipped, sustained, cared for. Wonderfully different models, of course, but Ganga is still, of course, an absolutely central goddess. Indeed, Ganga herself brought an action in the Indian High Court against the local industries that were polluting her. And it went to the Supreme Court before they decided that Ganga did not actually. The feeding Nile and the cleansing, saving Ganges is something that will, I think, be of great interest to discuss in looking at how you divinize a river. Getting out of a bath. How do we know it's divine? And how shocking to have a goddess, not necessarily naked, that's not unheard of, just to look at the Lakshmi, if it is a Lakshmi or the divine by the wealth of the jewelry. This figure doesn't. What is going on? And what does it mean? Why do these gods matter? The big question, which is really explosive, which many people, Indian gods don't die. They go on, Vishnu takes different forms, Shiva takes different forms. They metamorphose, but they never die. The divine can't die. It happens when a monotheism takes over. Because, of course, these gods die because of the arrival of Christianity and Constantine and the abandonment of the temples and of the gods once the Roman Empire becomes a monotheist Christian empire. It's a very big message in contemporary India. This is what happens if a monotheism is in control. It takes us back to Aurangzeb, or the construction of Aurangzeb that we began with. Dead in the West. These gods are no longer worshipped and haven't been worshipped, as far as we know, for certainly 1,500 years. But the beautiful body has 1,000 years later by Botticelli for the birth of Venus, exactly the same pose. It becomes the perfection of feminine beauty. The gods' bodies, which were the sign of their divinity, have remained objects of worship, even though the spiritual dimension has got lost. And these forms of the gods only developed, and where these were recently cited in Mumbai. Apollo and Aphrodite are gods in India. It's where we really end. And I'm sorry it's been so long, but it takes us back, I think, to draws no the perfect, the divine. If it is, it's probably, and it may be a terrible reflection on our world, it is now probably the idea of the physical perfection on a beach in California.
But thank you for being all here. Right, we're not going to take questions.